Pro account.
I think it's recording, starting recording. It is recording. Okay.
Yep.
Great. So, yeah, were you guys already chatting something when I joined? I don't mean to reset. Or were you just chatting about how I was not here?
No. We were just chatting casually about it. Not
Okay, cool. So I wanted to get in touch with everybody and just chat a little bit about the Workspaces feature. It's one that that is important. It's part of the grand unified theory that we're doing, which I can talk a little bit about as well if everybody's not already familiar with that. It's a complicated one for sure, and the different approaches that we can take have different trade-offs. I'd like for us to get out of the analysis phase as best we can, but I think we do really realistically need a little bit more discussion in order to make that happen. So maybe first thing to talk about is everybody already familiar with that powerful integrated primitives section on the website? I can share my screen, and it's linked to in the agenda item.
I had read through it, but I didn't fully, go in details.
Yeah, it's understandable. I can walk us through it as just to get started. There's a ton of stuff here, and there's even like a 45-minute or an hour video of talking through it. But the idea overall is that there's a few powerful primitives that we can implement in GitLab that when you implement them all, they add up into something that's actually really, really nice. And we've seen some reflections of that with Philippe's comment talking about the DAG and Workspaces. You can see how those things tie together, where it makes that feature more powerful. For anybody who's not familiar with the DAG, the idea is that we will build out pipeline execution using directed acyclic graph, which is really just a fancy way of saying it will build a tree and execute all the leaves of the tree as quickly as it possibly can. It's relatively straightforward to support that. It's really different from our stages model today, where we execute in parallel everything that's in one stage, then we execute everything in parallel in the next stage. So that one has some complications, if not on the technical side, then on kind of like the UI side, because it's going to really change how things are displayed, because there's no more trusting that things can fall into these clear buckets. But anyway, that's another feature that's part of these sets of primitives. Workspaces make the DAGs nicer because, well, for the reasons that Philippe said in the comments, but also it's just a way to kind of naturally build out a workspace that follows the branches of the tree of the DAG. So you can build things up naturally. They don't get over large, where I think if we implement Workspaces now, it'll be really easy, and maybe it will even be nice for people to just say, like, put everything in the workspace in every one of my jobs and just kind of do that by default. But then they can become quite large and maybe become unwieldy. There's also a few items here about simplifying configuration. We talk about JSON here as a templating engine. There's other ones out there as well. I can't remember the one that Ansible uses. But there's many ways to template out configuration, so we can use that potentially in the future to make things simple. We have the generic executor, which is kind of, in a way, another way to do this. There's a nice product that Drone came out, or a nice feature that Drone came out recently, where you can set a Cartesian product, and it will run a job against kind of like all of the combinations on the matrix. So if you're doing things like a monorepo, or even like if you're building for phones or something, you need to target a bunch of different processors and cross-compile them, it makes the configuration much, much easier to implement. And then there's also this item 45828 here, which is sort of like the be-all, end-all, which says, don't worry about giving us a GitLab CI YAML. Give us a script that we can run, and if it outputs a GitLab CI YAML, then we will execute the GitLab CI YAML as if, so it's like a way to bootstrap it and would let people implement basically anything as code. One really interesting thing here that Camille had mentioned at one point as a nice idea is it could be a way to support different configurations for like Jenkins, and just like import those, process them, and then output GitLab CI YAML in real time. But anyway, those are all sort of around simplifying configuration. As the DAG comes in, as Workspaces come in, configuration is going to get more and more complex, so it's something that we want to keep track of. Pipeline entity model is one that we haven't thought about as deeply, but you can sort of, I'll try to paint a picture of it. But the idea is that it would be something like reflection for pipelines, so that they could query their own internal state or query the state of pipelines running in a different project and ask about things like, did any jobs in the pipeline running in the most recent pipeline running in another project produce an artifact with the extension .xml? And if so, then do something with that based on the behaviors in the job. That's a pretty extreme example that I'm having a hard time thinking of a use case for. But a really interesting one here is just even within the same pipeline, querying for artifacts that may have been produced as part of a previous job. So if you have a job, for example, that runs, you might have a bunch of different jobs that produce JUnit XML output or testing output of different kinds. You could implement then one job that says, run me if any pipelines produce a file called JUnit.xml, in which case then you're not having to do all this kind of like code implementation to simulate that in the GitLab CI YAML. You can just define it based on the behaviors. And then the last one here is namespaces for includes. So includes are another way that we're managing complexity. But right now the way that includes work is it just mushes everything into a single namespace, which can make it really hard to reason about what it's actually going to do in certain scenarios. And you can run into conflicts with, if you're, one of the things that we've sort of thought about, and Auto DevOps does this to a certain extent, is the idea that there can be kind of like a library of templates out there. And Auto DevOps provides some, like it has the SAST scan, desk scan, it has review app, and these are all kind of little modules that you can plug in. Well, because they're all not namespace, if we have more customers producing these, if we have users producing them, if we have enterprises producing them, and they're all merging them together, there's a very good chance at some point somebody's going to call something the same thing and it's going to break in really hard to understand ways. So by namespacing these and formally importing them in some way, like, I mean, there's a million different ways we can do this, but that would allow those behaviors to be packaged better and shared. And would also, for even relatively simple use cases, like not using all these includes from lots of different places, even if you just have a mono repo and you've got 10 or even 50 different microservices in there, you're going to want to namespace each one just so that they're not bumping into each other, because all of them are going to do different things that are kind of the same but kind of different. And yeah, hopefully you can see a bit how these all sort of tie into each other. And if you were to implement all of these, you'd have a really, really nice CI system. I'll pause here. Any questions or on the bigger picture? Makes sense? Okay, good. So then that brings us to Workspaces, which was sort of arbitrarily picked as one of the first places that we could enter into doing this. But it's not necessarily correct, right? Because we're running into questions like, well, how is this going to interact with the DAG? So my first question is if we're getting hung up on Workspaces a bit, maybe should we just call it and jump into something else, and then by the time we come back to Workspaces, it will be more clear what the right way to do Workspaces is. I'm not like I haven't pre-decided that that's the right conclusion or anything, but I'm wondering it, just coming into it fresh. And if we do Workspaces, then we do need to sort of keep all of these in mind. I think that the most important one that's contextual for this one is this one, because it's going to play together at a pretty deep level. And we wouldn't want to implement this, for example, on the back end where the stages are really kind of important and it's implemented in that way. It really needs to just rely on upstream as the parent so that it can not be refactored when it works with this, or so that it doesn't have to be refactored when it works with this. Does that help?
I think that helps a lot. I think the problem with Workspaces right now, why we've been spending a lot of meetings about it, is we still haven't figured out what problems we're going to solve yet. Yeah. We defined like what problems it can solve and how to solve those problems, but like we haven't picked up which one. For example, Common example of the Android repo where it generates gigabytes of binaries that needs to be shared between 3 simple jobs, for example.
Yeah.
Artifact for the security products where they're building multiple Docker containers. Or another fact is setting up artifacts and cache is complex for the user, so we would like to make that simple. So those are like the 3 big problems that we can solve. And like if we really want to focus on one single problem, we can solve it in a different way than the other ones. So I think that's like the biggest problem, like dependencies and things like that. They are problems we need to discuss, but I think the first problem we need to figure out is which one we're going to solve and what is going to be the scope of Workspaces. Because right now it can solve a lot of problems, but we haven't defined the scope for it.
Yeah. Yeah, great question. Everybody else feels similarly that that's the first place to jump in?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, so I think that the original conception of this idea was not so much about the kind of very large workspaces and those specific use cases, which I do agree is more like a sticky runner kind of scenario where you've really just got a complex environment and you just need to build there. This was more like if you're just getting into GitLab CI, and the fact that it's clearing the kind of state between every step of every job in your pipeline would come as a surprise. You know, for me personally, I got used to it pretty quickly, and but people who've been working in Jenkins may just be much more familiar with the idea that it's actually building on a single host, and like every step just kind of runs in parallel. So they may, you know, break their head a bit when it comes to this. I don't feel overall though that that's like the strongest use case for it. I think it is nice, and certain users will kind of onboard into GitLab CI easier. But honestly, it was pretty straightforward. I did this in my career, so like I had this job, I had this perspective, and it's, you know, it's not confusing unless you're like in a really kind of old school state of mind. But like I said, it would help in situations where it builds locally, you can't figure out why it doesn't build on a remote machine, and it's because, you know, each job has its own workspace. But that said, for the DAG, I think there's a more interesting use case here. So I think that ultimately is the one that we want to optimize for. And there's actually pretty unique cases that come with that. If we pull up Philippe's thing here, let me find that issue. I can share my screen again in a moment. Oh. Did we move this issue or something? Oh, okay.
Yeah, that issue is at the bottom.
I need to update my link next time I do the pass-through. Okay. All right. This is very helpful also. Thank you for adding that, Fabio. We can come to that in a minute. Right. So Philippe was talking about the Docker point of view, and another really interesting one for this is data science, where Meltano wanted to use GitLab CI for doing builds, essentially data builds, but they weren't able to because we didn't have the DAG, which was kind of the first problem they ran into. They sort of have a mono repo type use case where they have essentially, if you imagine a single project, it will have 10 things in it. Unlike a mono repo, which is based on like 10 different microservices, it was 10 different data sources that are adding or dealing with data. So that you know, each one kind of independently needs to be able to evaluate if there's any changes to the data, and then do all of its follow-on steps. And it really doesn't matter what the other ones are doing, because they're all sort of operating independently. So that's why they need the DAG. But the next thing they would have run into if we gave them the DAG is managing the workspaces between all of those things, because they are producing intermediary files at each step. So what they would need for their use case, and I think Philippe's is similar, but we can dive into that next, is that they want to be able to use the state of the previous one that's upstream, and they don't care about anything else that happens. I think that the use keyword does make sense for that, where because you would just say it uses the previous one. But I think almost it's even simpler for them, where they would say, just always give me the workspace of the one, anything that's upstream from me, and then it will be fine. That's exactly what they want. So each branch of the tree would have its own workspace that it's building over time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I'd like to echo Fabio's point for the use keyword. To me, like the use keyword is trying to solve dependencies, and that's what DAG is doing at the end of the day. I think the use keyword and the workspace keyword should be separate.
Yeah, agreed. And we have the needs keyword for how we're going to define the DAG. So if we, I think this is probably it's not a DAG issue, but
so maybe like I think that like I'm still gonna say that DAG seems great, but maybe we don't need DAG at all. and that can be solved by better like namespacing of the includes.
Mm-hmm.
And like kind of like forcing you to create multiple smaller pipelines rather than trying to create one Uber pipeline with like the very complex follow-ups and trying to evaluate that out of the order. About the workspaces, I think I'm thinking like, because the DAG is interesting, but I'm not sure if I would connect DAG with the workspaces.
Sorry, repeat that? You're not sure you would what?
Okay, sorry. Just ignore my question. Please move on. Sorry.
I only just didn't hear you. I just didn't. It's not that I disagreed.
No. I'm thinking about like how the workspaces could work and like how it fits like with the DAG and everything else, because with the workspaces we still gonna have within the single pipeline multiple execution paths for time being, until we make something to make like the single pipeline to be independent to each other. Also, like I think that like this specific of the GitLab, that we execute things horizontally without sharing the data. In some cases, it's basically it's very good because it allows you to highly parallelize the workload, like how we use that for the GitLab CE. So I think that we need to have the solution that allow us to answer like that need, that it's not that like we create a single workspace, but rather we allow you to have different workspaces within single pipeline. And it to some extent resembles DAG, because it means that we should start executing a little out of the order. And this is really tricky, like how we should execute this stuff. If they're like on the single stage, you have like two jobs that are creating two different workspaces. Should you actually start executing a job from another stage when the second job for the second workspace didn't finish? But maybe like this another job depends on this second build that is creating another workspace with the dependencies.
Yeah. And you can sort of imagine building out that relationship. Like if you just changed this use keyword, or didn't even change it, to needs, then you would sort of have both with one keyword, at least for this example, right? Where you would know what order you need to build things in, and you would also know what workspaces are needed where, with the same keyword, which I think implies that we're sort of on the right track. I agree with you, Camille. I don't necessarily think that the DAG is the be-all, end-all solution, but what is needed, though, is that ability to just, split things into, either through a DAG or through some other means, split things into independent pipelines that can execute and operate independently.
So So I on the channel, maybe this is kind of like tangential point to think about like something much broader. On the channel, I was thinking about something that would allow us contain like the complexity. And like we had this issue about like multiple pipelines in a single GitLab CI YAML, which kind of it's like your incarnation of the include namespace. And this also, I think, is connected with the workspaces and the DAGs, because one of my proposals is like, let's not try to make namespaces to be thingy of the GitLab CI YAML, but rather make it easy to use our upstream, downstream dependencies with the status attribution to create a number of the sub-pipelines that are part of the same project, of the same repo, of the same context when we are executing. So now, if we would have, let's say that like we have GitLab CI YAML, we would say that like we have separate GitLab CI YAML for RSpec configuration. This would be fired as a separate pipeline with like separate stages, completely separate. But like we would attribute the status to the head pipeline. So this would more be like a sub pipeline. It's technically, to some extent, it re-implements a DAG concept. It to some extent implements like the contention of the config, because this config is like it's very like contained. It's just RSpec, it's your config. You get a status attribution, and it also allows us to much easier model workspaces, because just because this config is contained, for example, security products could use much more flexible out of execution of the workspaces within their config, because their config could be provided, for example, from template, and they would like ship the security products, but maybe the config would be contained in a way that let me open. Maybe for their use case, if they have the SaaS feature, the SaaS feature would be config take from template SaaS GitLab CI YAML, and this would be executed as a kind of like as a bridge job, as we do like upstream downstream dependencies today. But like just because this config will be self-contained, they would control their own workspace within the config. Whatever we figure out the syntax, they would not really like change any of the contexts. They would have their own stages, but like you would get a status attribution to your pipeline about whether like this succeeded or not, or how it succeeded. Like,
then you can simplify it and just make a workspace per pipeline, and you can just simplify that feature away.
And maybe, yes, exactly. And maybe then like you would have as part of the like the default config, you would say workspace default. Let's say that you are just this is like the top level configuration of what makes all CI jobs to share the same context, pretty much. So they would be executed by single runner, but when we are using workspaces, we are just basically starting to be more restrictive. We are saying that like within the single stage, you can use just only single workspace if you follow up on the second stage. So like kind of simplify some of like these edge cases about when to execute, how it retries, and things like that by being more restrictive on the workspace's behavior on the single level of the GitLab CI YAML config, because GitLab CI YAML would be by definition not something that could describe multiple pipelines, but rather it would be something that describes, by definition, a single pipeline, and by definition, as small as possible pipeline. So you would have multiple pipelines within a pipeline, kind of creating a hierarchy of the pipelines, but kind of it would force you to create a much smaller primitive. So modeling of the workspaces would be much easier, likely, for you. So this is this is kind of my thoughts about like support for multi pipeline within single repo, because this also actually I think answers mono repo solution, because you could have you could create like hierarchy of the mono repos that are like executed based on the config changes from the top level config, and each of these config could also handle their own workspaces pretty much, whatever the solution we take.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It makes me think that maybe Jason was right. Maybe we should rethink prioritization. Maybe start with this dependence, like this multiple pipeline or DAG or whatever we call it, and
Well,
then
yeah, it's not
actually
really
come
the
back.
DAG because the DAG is a special case, but I think that it is. So what Camille is describing, you could write some code that could split a pipeline into that automatically for you, and then you sort of have like that DAG analysis that's generating that config that will start by letting people generate by hand. It makes the pipelines an atomic unit, which is kind of how everything is implemented in the product today, which is nice that we're not then rethinking that. It also sort of implements namespaces in a way because each of those things is running as its own pipeline. Workspaces become simpler because you can just say, well, we're not going to really worry too much about like what's upstream and downstream in the whole big picture. We're just going to say you can split things up in a nice way, however you want, and then each one will get its own workspace, and essentially for free. And yeah, this is exactly what I was thinking, like why we should think about the order we're doing things in, and the fact that we were running into so many troubles with Workspaces made it feel like we were starting at the wrong thread. Did I summarize that right, Camille? I want to make sure that I fully understood the points you were making there.
So it's not about automatic generation. It's more about like approach to organize multiple pipelines within a single project, something that we try to solve for the monorepos, and like to like namespace includes something that you are described. Because I think that like if we solve like this problem of like multiple pipelines within single project, the workspaces and like creating outline how these workspaces should work makes it much easier because we may be more restrictive about like in what circumstances workspaces do work. Maybe you just specify I want workspace, and it means that all your CI jobs to share the workspace. There is no other option. You just choose a one option of the operation, which is use workspaces or not use workspaces. So like the old way. But we allow you to easily have like multiple pipelines within single project having different behavior. So one pipeline could have like one workspace by definition, that it's like all jobs share one workspace, but the other pipeline that is executed like because of the dependency on the ordering of the operation could just follow the old way. It's up to you. So this is like kind of twisting around the problem, I guess, from my side. If we define differently, like what does it mean the pipeline and how big is the entity of the pipeline, maybe then we don't have to use the use keyword which says follow up, because this is one of the requirements for when we have to retry and things like that. And maybe we can just say your workspace, you can say that you share workspace, but your pipeline has to be as small as possible to make this efficient. Otherwise, you're gonna create a bottleneck on your pipeline. But then we just give you primitives to run multiple pipelines within in parallel as part of the single commit execution. And this is the primitive that you should use for that purpose. And then it kind of also responds to our composability of included configuration, because each template becomes a separate configuration for the pipeline that you include in your. It doesn't modify the global state of the pipeline. You rather put that as a job within your pipeline, and you choose the place where you want this to execute. So it kind of you kind of define exactly the bigger picture instead of each primitive.
Yeah.
And then basically DAG. This is interesting case because I think that DAG, most people want DAG because they want to have this out of order execution. When I talk with some customers, they have build Windows, do something, test Windows, do something, deploy Windows. This is in different stage. Let's say that this is deploy stage. And I was for a long time thinking that DAG is great, but it just creates so complex logic and so complex like interaction within the pipeline.
Yeah.
That maybe we don't need a DAG. Maybe we just need a better way for you to describe your intended workflow. And consider this example. If you have like this simple pipeline, build Windows, build test Windows, deploy Windows, they are executed as you want, pretty much. You want to execute tests as quickly as a build finishes, deploy when the test finishes. The problem starts to happen if you have the, let's say, build OS X.
Yeah.
Test OS X.
They're waiting for everything to finish.
Test OS X, sorry, deploy OS X, and this actually creates a contention.
Yeah.
But maybe then this is one way to phrase the problem. It's like the efficiency of the current pipelines, and maybe the different way is like, let's say that like you have the GitLab CI, let's say build, deploy, test, build, test, deploy, YAML. But what is happening, like you have your top level pipeline following the syntax, which says Windows. I'm testing Windows, and this is my config file. And I'm passing variables, which define like what I'm doing. So like goas would be Windows. Let's say that this is a Golang example, MD64, and you just have the same config file that is for OS X, and basically it solves that case because you create a small pipeline that just execute these stages in an order as you want them, like using all the existing features, but like you have this top-level pipeline that defines you like the high-level overview. I do not really care whether like my Windows pipeline is on the build or test or deploy stage. I do care that it's still running and it did not succeed. If I do care that it did fail, I can just then go quickly to this like smaller pipeline to see, for example, why it did fail or did not fail, on what case. So this is one of the examples how what DAG solves, because with DAG you just free to say the test windows, I don't know, let's say after or whatever the name we use that.
Needs, but yeah.
And do it like that. But you kind of then you have to also grab the pipeline to make it then meaningful.
Yeah.
Concord did great, but it's really hard thing to order like all these nodes in the order that makes them sense. But in this case, at least this like example of like nested includes within the single project or like sub pipelines executed solves this case beautifully. And actually also solves the case of like the contained configuration that doesn't affect other ones. And it's even more interesting because if we have our rules that we're gonna work, let's say that this is still only, we can say that we run this sub pipeline for the Windows only on the master, which has their own rules when we can execute them.
Yeah.
And this actually allows you much different type of the flexibility, because you can define like from the bigger primitives to the middle size primitives to the smaller primitives.
Yeah, and you can also, for a mono repo that's doing microservices, this could be paths, right? So it could be each folder.
Yes, and actually for the mono repos, we could be even clever because we could generate that file by definition for you from all the directories that have like the GitLab CI YAML, and then like we could make the mono repo. The mono repo I tend to use like for the Ruby race, and there is like a number of the gem files with the mono repos, like active support. So this active support could basically look like that.
What if you, Camille? What if you moved this configuration of the only changes into the active support /.gitlab ci.yaml, and then instead of implementing this file, you just find all of the GitLab CI YAMLs in the whole repository and build this file out automatically, essentially, for the user.
So yes, and this is a very interesting case. I think that it could be built automatically as a next step, but right now it seems that would be easier if you would have that not automatic. But about your question, I think that the thing that we are discussing now, workflow rules, exactly allow us to define that behavior, because it allows you to say, I want to run that on the changes on active support. And basically, that way allow you to model exactly that on the top level of the pipeline, then you don't need really like this granular config, for example.
Because having to, like, every time they add a GitLab CI YAML somewhere, when they add a new repository, also just go put the same boilerplate code in the GitLab, in the base one, feels wrong.
So actually, yes, this is very valid point, Jason, and like workflow rules would allow us to support, but that because you could say, I want to run that always when active support, or maybe my branch is master. So technically, you just keep this very simple configuration as a top level pipeline, but like you have these workflow rules that defines the behavior for the monorepo, and effectively, it could be either part of the workflow rules, or it could be part of your top level job, and exactly like what kind of conditions this job is being created on.
And that would also make it so that there's no special case here, right? If you just put a single .gitlab CI YAML in the root, that's the only one it finds. It just runs it as normal.
Exactly.
It's elegant. That's a good sign.
And then we could, if we would have this solution, we could be very restrictive about the workspaces behavior, because we could say that we just don't allow you the granularity of creating workspace per job, but we just allow you to say that the workspace is created for the whole pipeline. And this pipeline just works in slightly different manner, but just because we have this simple primitive of like allowing you to execute the composable configuration that are like full-fledged GitLab CI YAMLs within your pipeline, this like modification of the workspaces can work basically, because by having like the single like top-level configuration for the workspaces, it limits the behavior of the pipeline, but it also makes for us to simpler to think about what is the execution flow of the pipeline, and like how to evaluate the follow-ups on that pipeline. But you kind of like you choose like the behavior then. Is it like whether you use workspaces or not, instead of us having kind of hybrid solution that we can define the workspace on kind of per job basis, which is like harder because there is so many edge cases and conditions how we should work around them.
Yeah.
And then, for example, for the retry functionality, we could say that if you use like the top-level workspaces and you run that on the stage, let's say deploy, because one of my concerns about the retry was like, who is the follow-up? What we have to run in order to follow up, and it could be like very simple. If we have like the top-level workspace, like in this example, I'm looking for the example. Let me share this example. So if we have the workspace and we have the top level definition of the workspace, let's say this is, I don't know, or workspace, yes, because I don't think that we would allow it to configurable more. Then we could basically say about the logic. The logic for the workspaces would be that if you try to retry the deploy job, it means that we're gonna let's say that we're not gonna have the workspace, so we're gonna automatically rebuild, like build, test, and run the deploy after executing these two first ones. Because like one of the challenges of the like running workspace, we don't know like what to prefill. but maybe the logic for that would be could be very simple. That like if you have like 3 different stages and you retry the third stage, we just rerun everything in the first 2 stages, because we assume that this is a required feat for us to prefill the workspace. Maybe then like the optimization for that is to have some additional option on the test, which says I don't know, let's say like very verbose, just to showcase builds workspace. Let's say that this test job doesn't build the workspace, so we know that we don't have to retry this test job when you retry deploy, because this test job only consumes the workspace, but it doesn't add to the workspace. Yeah. So maybe this is the other way to kind of iterate on like how the dependencies between workspaces could look like.
That is how Circle does it. They have a load and a save, or like attach and create, and it just creates layers. And then if you attach, then it figures out the union of all the layers that you need and makes them available. So it knows internally if it's contributing to or just relying upon a workspace.
So it could be even like that: workspace create, workspace use, or just because we have this default config, it could be even like workspace create, but this is default option that you use. And workspace use, you could just override some behavior. Because like we need to know exactly, if we have like the single configuration for the workspace, we need to know exactly what we need to run before we retry stuff.
Yeah.
To prefill the workspace.
Yeah. Okay. So I think like the very first thing to do for 12.2 is probably just swap multiple pipelines per GitLab CI YAML and workspaces, which would move workspaces to 12.4, which is just sort of a holding place. I can take a pass at grooming the multi-pipelines per GitLab CI YAML into something deliverable and then have everyone review it. Is there an MVC that can be delivered in a release here for this thing that's valuable? I don't know how much work is required to implement what we described. I think that there's UX elements to make sure that, because there's a new kind of, like we'll be starting all these pipelines in parallel, which is something that we already do today, so presumably that's not totally wild. But there's a new kind of like collector pipeline where the status attribution for all of these things comes together into.
So we work on the right now with Mattia on the status attribution of the I'm always confusing upstream or downstream.
We actually call it it is the downstream, but it's
so technically, like we're gonna have the status attribution by that, right? So technically. Yeah. It's another type of the trigger that is loopback trigger to the same repository, just using different configuration file, and like different, it would maybe create a different type of the pipeline. But to some extent, I think like the hardest part of the status attribution is being worked on right now.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any other hard bits in here that jump out?
Like creating the special, like annotating the pipeline that this is like the sub pipeline instead of like the top level pipeline, because we choose the pipelines for the commit state tools attribution, for the match request attribution. But I think that it should be pretty much like the single like flag or source or something like that. And it doesn't seem like that hard.
Yeah.
But I think the bigger challenge is really figuring out what the like level the EE Premium or EE Starter is that for, because if we would have to implement that in the CE, for example, there is a challenge that we would have to backward some of these changes into CE that we have today in the EE.
Yeah, good question. I think that this is a good EE feature. Yeah. I mean, maybe it can be implemented in a way where there's no special cases here, but if you're in CE, it will only look for a GitLab CI YAML in the root folder and act on it. Whereas if you're in EE, then it will try and find them in the entire repo. But then from that point, once that list is made, the behavior is identical, potentially.
So I would say that maybe like the first probably iteration should be that like we just make it like allow you to put that configuration on your own. Automation could likely be like the second iteration, because the tricky part about like this the automation is like how it works with the auto DevOps. For example, we have kind of implicit auto DevOps configuration, and we cannot really like choose between two different types of the implicit configuration right now.
Yeah.
With like auto DevOps. So I think that we need to figure out how it fits with auto DevOps, and to actually to know like if we can create this configuration automatically. So I don't know that yet about like how it like connects with auto DevOps.
Yeah.
Okay, I started talking, everyone.
Now I'm thinking, that was a really good question. Yeah, but it's a follow-up. It doesn't need to be solved this second. So then, yeah, I think I am going to move this into 12.2 instead of Workspaces, but it needs to be a priority for us to figure out what we'll do here. It sounds like we're relatively close. We just have a few follow-ups, but let's prioritize those and try and come to a decision quickly here.
How does UX and front-end prioritization look like? Does it, like, since this one involves a lot of UX and front-end as well, do we have enough
I wonder if it has to, though. We should minimize it as much as possible.
I would imagine if we're gonna support like multi-pipelines, we have to show like multiple pipelines instead of one big pipeline. We just have to show multiple ones. So
Yeah.
we need some kind of UX and front end.
So actually, I think that it's about revisiting what we support for the triggers upstream, downstream, because it basically reads on that concept, and maybe we just don't need a ton of new UX yet. I don't know that.
The orchestrator pipeline, if we can make a special kind of pipeline that has like this list in it, maybe it just has no stages, it just has like a list of everything it triggered, and then you can navigate to them. Maybe that's sufficient UX. And if that's the pipeline that shows up in the merge request and various places, I think that that's actually correct.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just wanted to bring out the point we need to do them as early as possible, since there's some work involved.
So I think that, like, from my perspective, I would think what would take us, like, from the engineering point of view and like how it works with the product. If you would say that, like, we say that we define a workspace for all jobs. So like there is like on or off switch. I mean, on says that like we share the workspace across all jobs. So this is like the simplest possible approach for creating workspace. There's only one option that controls that, and try to evaluate like all like edge cases that we know how it could work and what it would take for us to support like these edge cases. So like what would be the next steps? Because it seems that like we likely gonna not allow like this granularity on configuring workspace per job, but rather we say that the whole pipeline is just sharing workspace that way.
Yeah.
Okay. Because like that's if we can support multiple pipelines, we can create more pipelines that all the dependency and scheduling issues comes away. And we can implicitly say that a workspace is created by default. and then we can use the create and so on in the future.
Yep. Okay, I took a bunch of notes in the issue. We're out of time. Please do read through them. Hopefully it's understandable. And add comments or edit if there's anything wrong. And then I will take this a little bit later today, put it into the multiple pipelines issue, and then adjust them as well. Oops. Okay.
Sounds good.
Oh,
Thanks for the conversation, everybody. It was really good.
Thank you.
hey guys.